Okay, we are ready to start the second lecture. So it's a pleasure to have today Khrystyna Serhiyenko from University of Kentucky talking about introduction to cluster algebra, and she is joining on Zoom. Thank you very much. Feel free to start.
Thank you. So let me start by thanking the organizers, Matteo and Laurent, for the invitation to speak here and also the ability to do so remotely. So I'm very excited to participate in this conference. And so the plan today is to tell you about cluster algebras. And so first I'm going to talk about the definitions and the constructions, and then we're going to specialize to talk about the special case of the Grassmannians, and then the connection, the combinatorics of that, which is hidden in that of the plabic graphs. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the special case of type AN and the triangulations of polygons. So this relates very well to the topics we've seen in the first lecture today. Is just we're going to reinterpret all of these objects from the point of view of cluster algebras. All right, so let us start. So what are cluster algebras? Cluster algebras were introduced by Fomin and Zelevinsky about 20 years ago, and it's a particular class of commutative rings that lie inside the field of rational functions on the variables x1 through xn. And after their introduction, there's been a lot of discovered connections to various other fields of mathematics and physics, which made this topic very, very exciting. And so the interplay between the different areas has led to some really wonderful results in the field. So in particular, so cluster algebras have lots and lots of connections to combinatorics, and that's what we'll see today, because the definition already can be quite combinatorial. There are also connections to representation theory and lots of geometry, including tropical geometry, symplectic geometry, positive geometries, as we will hopefully see in this workshop. Also some knot theory, number theory, and many, many other topics. Okay, so there are lots of dots here, which we don't fail, but lots of exciting connections, and hopefully we can discover some more here as well. Okay, so let me start with a definition and the construction, which may be somewhat complicated, but hopefully we'll unpack it. So, so our starting object is a quiver Q. So a quiver is just a directed graph, a finite directed graph, and the things we do not allow are loops and two cycles. So a two cycle, you have two vertices and you have two arrows in between them that go in opposite directions. So these are the configurations we do not allow. You may have arrows going in the same direction, multiple arrows, so that would be okay. For convenience, we're always going to label the vertices in our quiver 1 through n, and then there's a local operation on the quiver called a mutation. So what's a mutation of a quiver? So you choose a vertex, any vertex, and you're going to mutate at that vertex, and you obtain a new quiver, which we're going to denote by mu sub I of q, which can be obtained from our initial quiver by applying the following 3 steps. Okay, so the first step is you look at the vertex I you're going to mutate. You look at the path of length 2 going through that vertex. So you want an arrow coming into I and an arrow coming out of I, and for every such path, you're going to add a direct arrow from J to K, so something which bypasses the vertex I. In step 2, you're going to reverse all arrows at I, so you change the direction of the arrows. And step 3 is, well, in steps 1 and 2, you possibly could have created some 2 cycles, and we don't like 2 cycles, so we're going to remove a maximal collection of those. So at the end, again, you produce the quiver, which has the same number of vertices, which still has no loops and no 2 cycles, so again, it's an allowed quiver. Okay, so let's do an example. So suppose this is my quiver Q. I have 3 vertices and 3 arrows, so this is a 3 cycle. And let's say I want to compute mu sub I of q. So I want to mutate at the vertex 1. So I'm going to apply my 3 steps. So my first step is I look at the arrows coming in, at the arrows coming out, there's just 1. And I'm going to add a new arrow for every such path. So I'm going to add this arrow from 3 to 2 for this, which accounts for this path. In my step 2, I reverse the direction of the arrows at 1. So that's what happened here. We reversed these 2. And in step 3, well, did I create any 2 cycles? We see this is a 2 cycle, so I'm going to pairwise remove 2 such arrows. And this removes the 2 cycles, and this is my resulting quiver. Okay, so that's the quiver mutation operation. And I didn't write this, but I should have, is that the quiver mutation is an involution. So if I started it with this quiver and I mutated at vertex 1 again, I would come back to the one I started. So doing the mutation twice gets you back to where you started. All right, so that's the quiver mutation. And now we want to define the cluster algebra. So again, we're going to start with some quiver. You fix a quiver. And then you have a cluster algebra A sub Q associated to the quiver Q, which is, it's going to be defined by a set of generators. And we call these generators cluster variables. And it's satisfying these generators are not independent. They satisfy some relations, and we call them exchange relations. And both the cluster variables and the exchange relations are computed recursively. So there is some recursive process you need to do to obtain all of this data. So, okay, so whenever you have a recursion, you need some starting point. So what is our starting point? Our starting point is something that's called an initial seed, and all the other objects are just called then seeds obtained from the initial one by a recursion process. So what is the data of my seed? I start with my initial quiver Q, the one I start with, and then I have a collection of my variables, my generators, which are just, the initial set is just x1 through xn, and they are grouped into this n set called a cluster. Okay, so initial seed, the data of the initial seed is a quiver, together with a cluster, which is just a collection of cluster variables of these x1 through xn. And then you want the recursion process, and the recursion process is something that's called, again, a mutation. So mutating a seed gives you a new seed, and you can mutate in any of the vertices. And so, okay, so new seed, just for now, I'm going to denote as mu sub k of my initial seed. And so you get a new cluster, a new collection of variables together with some new quiver. And this new quiver, the operation for getting this new quiver is the quiver mutation we've just seen on the previous slide. So this we understand. So I'm just going to tell you next what this is. But then the cluster algebra is then generated by the set of all cluster variables obtained from this initial seed by sequences of mutation. So you start with the initial seed, you mutate in all the possible vertices, you get like one step away from the initial seed, and then you mutate some more and more and more, and possibly you need to do so infinitely many times, and you keep building, you keep finding, generating more and more cluster variables. And so in this way, you build your cluster algebra. Okay, so I just have to tell you what is the mutation for the seed. Okay, so suppose I have some x sub q, x comma q. So what is the mutation of that seed? So again, the quiver, the mutation of the quiver is just the quiver mutation we've seen before. So what is the mutation of this cluster? So I start with this x, and this x is some collection of variables, f1 through fn, where these fi's are in the field of rational functions in the initial variables, x1 through xn. And then the mutation gives me a new collection of cluster variables where most of them are still the same, except the one in position k is going to change. So I'm going to denote this by fk sub fk prime. So only the one in position k changes because I'm mutating in position k. And then the relationship between the old and the new variable is given by this exchange relation, which is as follows. So the old variable fk times the new variable I'm looking for, fk prime, is a product of two monomials, where the first one is the product of all the cluster variables, where you take one for every arrow coming into the vertex k in the quiver. And the second one is similarly the product of all the cluster variables, f sub j, where you take the product of all the arrows coming out of vertex k. Okay, so this gives me a new expression. And so notice from here, you can actually solve for fk prime. You can divide by fk on both sides, and then you can see that this gives you, again, irrational functions in the variables x1 through xn. Okay, so let's pause here and actually do an example, because this can be a lot. So this is our quiver from the first example, and let's say we want to compute the cluster algebra associated to this quiver. So it's going to lie inside of the rational functions in 3 variables. So my initial seed is my quiver together with this cluster, which is just the initial variables, x1, x2, x3. I choose a direction to mutate. Let's say I mutate at vertex 1. Again, you should be mutating in all the possible directions if you want to generate the entire cluster algebra. So first I can mutate the quiver to go from here to here. And this is the same 1, 2, 3 steps we've done before. So this is the quiver. Here I'm just showing the 2 cycle that was deleted. Remember, we had to delete the 2 cycle that was formed. And then what is the new cluster? Well, I'm mutating 1. So my 2 and 3 variables, positions 2 and 3, remain the same. So they're not changed. And the variable in position 1, it has 2 monomials here. And the first one is the product over all the variables where you have an arrow coming into 1, or I guess, sorry, out of 1. So that's the 2. And in position 2, I have the variable x2. And then product of all the variables coming into 1, that's 3. And the variable in position 3 is x3. That's why it's just x2 plus x3 over the old variable in position 1. Okay, and now, again, this is recursion, so I can mutate again. And remember, if I mutate at 1, this is, again, actually an involution, so I would go back so that I'm not getting anything new in this way. So let's say I'm going to mutate at vertex 2. So then now this is my vertex 2. This is the quiver I associate to the seed. So to mutate the quiver is very easy at 2. There are no path going through 2. So I don't have to add any new arrows. I'm just going to reverse the arrow incident to 2. So I just reverse this arrow, and there are no 2 cycles. So the quiver mutation is easy. And now this, again, the seed mutation. So the variables in positions 3 and 1, they remain the same. I'm not changing. Only the variable in position 2 changes. And now I look at this quiver, and all the arrows that are coming into this vertex, well, there are no arrows. So it's the empty product, which is why I have a 1 here. Then I take the product of all the things coming out of the vertex 2, and this is the vertex 1. So I take the cluster variable in position 1, that's this one. So I get this monomial, this term plus 1 over the old variable in position 2, which is x2, and I get an expression like this. Okay, so hopefully this gives you an idea what's happening. And then the cluster algebra, by definition, is then generated by all of these cluster variables you get by doing this recursion. So it's the initial ones, x1, x2, x3, together with this first one we obtained, and then the second one we obtained in our process, and then many, many more. Okay, so you have to do this more and more times to get your cluster algebra. All right, so that's the definition. And so the two big results, which are not obvious from the definition, but are somehow the 2 big important properties of cluster algebras, are the following. So the first one is the Laurent phenomenon, which was shown by Fomin and Zelevinsky right as they discovered cluster algebras, is that, well, the cluster algebra actually lives inside the field not of rational functions, as I've been saying, but really inside of the Laurent polynomials in the variables x1 through xn, meaning the denominator here is always a monomial, it's just a single term. So it is not obvious from the definition. There is some sort of miraculous cancellation that happens here, and then the denominators clear away, and your cluster variables after performing these mutations are always Laurent monomials. And then the second result took somewhat longer to show, but it was already conjectured by Fomin and Zelevinsky. It was the fact, so this is known as the positivity, and it says that the cluster variables, if you look at their coefficients, they are actually non-negative. So you don't have any negative terms appearing. And again, this took some more time to show because, well, and it was shown in various particular cases for a long time. And then eventually, just from sort of the definition, using lots of formulas and computations, it followed one was able to deduce this finally. And so given these two results and the definition of cluster algebra, kind of the questions you might naturally want to ask are the following: is, can we find an explicit formula for these cluster variables? Because right now it's all a recursion process, which is somewhat involved. And while we want to understand these cluster variables and just be able to produce them without having would like to have some more understanding of them. And so can we produce them without the recursion? And the next natural question, well, since we know that the cluster variables are the coefficients there are positive integers, well, what are they actually counting? Can we come up with some combinatorial interpretation for them? And then another question which often comes up in cluster algebras is, well, can we find a nice basis for cluster algebras? And the nice here is in quotation marks, and again, depending on what you're looking for, you may have different definitions of nice. But for example, you always want to have, for example, cluster variables as elements of your basis. So these sort of three, I guess, questions have motivated a lot of work on cluster algebras. And some of these have multiple answers depending on maybe the types and the types of algebras you consider. So if you restrict to some particular types, you get some nicer combinatorics, some nicer answers. But these have been a lot of this have been motivated by these questions. Okay. Right. And sort of as a last thing, so if you're not very familiar with cluster algebras and you just want to do some examples, there's this very, very nice applet developed by Bernhard Keller, and you can just search Keller's mutation applet on Google and click on the first link, hopefully for you, and you'll get you to the right page. And so this applet allows you can build the quiver, you can add nodes, add arrows, delete nodes as needed. You can build a quiver and then click on the node and it will produce a quiver mutation for you. Moreover, you can actually download, there's a applet that you can actually download on your computer, and then there's more possibilities. It can actually calculate cluster variables for you and other data that would be associated to a cluster algebra, and you may want to explore. So it's been very nice if you want to just run some examples. And let me just point out, there's another button here called Freeze Nodes. And so what this does is if you click on a node, it's going to turn blue, or it's going to freeze it. And freezing the nodes in a cluster algebra means you kind of run the same procedure as before, but you're not going to be allowed to mutate at that frozen vertex, frozen node. So these are they are there, they keep track of some information, but you don't want to mutate there. And so I'm just mentioning this because it's going to come up in a few slides. Some additional things you can do. All right, so this is a nice advertisement for the mutation applet and for you to start exploring. And now I want to move on to the next topic is the Grassmannians, which we've seen before, but let me do it again briefly and also set up notation. So the Grassmannian, which is I'm going to denote by GRKN, is a set of k-dimensional linear subspaces of C to the n. And as we've seen, we can denote the elements of the Grassmannian as k by n matrices, and I'm going to say such matrix is A. So it has k rows and n columns, and the row span of A is going to correspond to the element of the Grassmannian. So this would be the k-dimensional linear subspace. And so we want them to be a full rank then. And then there are functions on the Grassmannian, elements of the Grassmannian called Plucker coordinates, which again, we've seen in the previous talk as well. So I'm going to start with I, a k-element subset of the integers 1 through n. And then P sub I of A is going to denote the Plucker coordinate. And so what it is, it just takes the maximal minor of A on the columns indexed by I, right? So my I picks out k columns in here, and I have k rows, so this gives me a k by k matrix, and so I take the determinant of that. So that's what the Plucker coordinate does. And then we're going to be interested in the coordinate range of the Grassmannian, or really the homogeneous coordinate range of the affine cone over the Grassmannian, but yeah. So we're interested in functions on the Grassmannian. And sort of a theorem that's been even before cluster algebras is it is known that the coordinate range of the Grassmannian is generated by these Pluka coordinates, p sub I, where you take all of them, and then modulo some Pluka relations that the Pluka coordinates satisfy. And so, for example, if you just take sort of the simplest non-trivial example, the Grassmannian of two planes in a four-dimensional space, then the coordinate range is generated by these Pluka coordinates p12, p13, p14, p23, 2, 4, and 3, 4. So these are all the two-element subsets of 1 through 4. And in this case, there's just a single Pluka relation, three-term Pluka relation. And just to make sure we understand everything, we are on the same page. So for example, I can take A to be this somewhat generic element of the Grassmannian. So it has rank 2. My A, B, C, D are some variables or whatever you want them to be, some arbitrary elements. And then, so you can check that this relation indeed is satisfied for example, this element. So you can compute, let's say, P13 and P24 for the matrix A. So what is P13 of A? You take the first and the third column, so this, and then you would take the determinant of this matrix, which gives me just C. And then you can do it for the rest of the variables. You can compute the determinants, and indeed you get that this is satisfied, okay? So these are the things we are talking about. Just to make it more concretely. So that's so again, this was known before cluster algebras. And then after the cluster algebras, Scott showed that the coordinate range of the Grassmannian does have a cluster structure. It is a cluster algebra. And this is one of the most kind of well-known and very exciting cluster algebras. And sort of in this construction, what's nice is right, in order to find a cluster algebra, you need to tell me what the cluster variables are, for example. And in general, this is an infinite set, but all of the nice functions, Pluka coordinates, are examples of cluster variables. So Pluka coordinates are cluster variables, but in general, there are many more, and this is a proper subset. And so in our example, remember the 2,4 Grassmannian, it is generated by these Pluka coordinates via this relation. And so now the way to think about this relation is this is the exchange relation where you have the old variable times the new variable is a product of two monomials. And so what is the structure of this cluster algebra? Well, it turns out that this is just it has the structure of a cluster algebra where you just have one vertex, one mutable vertex. So the quiver would be as follows. For example, you have this P13, that's the mutable cluster variable, and you actually have these 4 other ones. These are frozen, so you would never mutate at that vertex. If you mutate here at P13, you get a new seed, so a new quiver with a new collection of cluster variables. And this exchange relation is again the mutation, which tells you that if you mutate at P13, the new cluster variable is P24, and then the others remain the same. And again, since mutation is an involution, if you mutate here again, you get back to here. So this is it. This is all the structure there is. So there is just 2 seeds, these squared, these boxed cluster variables, these are frozen, so you don't mutate at them. And the P13 and P24, these are the mutable ones. And so this coordinate range has the structure of a cluster algebra. Now, where is this coming from? So that's what I want to explain next. What is this? I have seen that this may be somewhat mysterious. And so the answer comes from plabic graphs. And so the idea is these plabic graphs, they explain the cluster structure on the coordinate range of the Grassmannian, where all the cluster variables are actually Pluka coordinates. So we don't have a good understanding of the cluster structure beyond that. But in the case where all the seed just contains Pluka coordinates, you have a good understanding. And so here's the plabic graph we've seen in the previous talk. So as before, G is said to be stands for plabic. Plabic means planar bicolored, and I'm going to color my vertices black and white, and it is going to be drawn inside a disk. So this is my plabic graph. I have some black and white vertices. I'm going to draw it inside the disk, and I'm going to label the edges of the graph that attach to the boundary of my disk by integers 1 through n, let's say clockwise. And then one can perform moves, local moves on the graph G. The first one is a square move. So whenever you see a square face in your plabic graph, where the colors of the face alternate, colors of the vertices alternate, so I have black, white, the move tells you, well, you can, the move is to switch the colors of all the vertices. So you see this was black, white, white, black, black, and all of this, these vertices just change color. So that's the first local move. The second local move says that whenever you have a vertex of degree 2, here I did a white vertex. This could also be a black vertex. You can just remove it, and so just you don't have a vertex anymore. You just have that segment. And the last move is a contraction. So whenever you have two vertices connected by an edge and they are of the same color, well, you can contract along this edge and get the following configuration. Okay. So that's what's called local moves on my plabic graph. Moreover, we don't want to consider all the plabic graphs. We want to consider the nice ones, and the nice ones are called reduced. Again, something we've seen in the previous talk. And the graph is called reduced if it cannot be transformed via local moves to a graph containing these two forbidden configurations. So we don't want a digon. So there's nothing on here. Digon is just you have these two vertices and two edges between them, and they can be of any color. So we don't like that. And moreover, we don't want to see any internal leaves. So something like this. So there's can be stuff here, but yeah, we don't want this sticking out. And okay, so from now on, if I forget, we're really just talking about reduced plabic graphs. These are the nice ones. All right, so next, we're gonna slowly make our way back to this thing we started with, back to cluster algebras. So first, I'm gonna tell you how to get a quiver from a graph G. So given a plabic graph G, we're gonna associate the quiver, we're gonna denote by Q of G as follows. So my vertex, my plabic graph G, it has internal faces, and internal faces are gonna correspond to mutable vertices. And my boundary faces are going to correspond to frozen vertices. So faces correspond to vertices, internal are mutable, and the ones adjacent to the boundary are frozen, so the ones you're not allowed to mutate. And the arrows in the quiver are as follows. Whenever you have an edge in the plabic graph between two differently colored vertices, we're going to draw an arrow such that the black vertex appears on the right and the white vertex is on the left. So in our example, of a plabic graph, we have the following quiver. We have these two faces, two internal faces, which means we have two mutable vertices. On the outside, we have these boundary faces. So these would be frozen variables, which I denote by squares. And you have arrows. So for example, this is an edge between two differently colored vertices, and I'm going to draw an arrow between the associated vertices such that the black vertex is on the right of the arrow. And notice this is an edge between two vertices of the same color, so this one doesn't produce an arrow. And then, well, you want to know, we had these local moves, and maybe you want to know how the local moves behave with respect to the associated quiver, and things behave quite well. So if you do this first move, the square move, or you have a square and you change the colors, this actually corresponds to a quiver mutation. And so this is just an example of that, but something you can check. So for example, in this configuration, let's say you have this arrow coming in and this arrow coming out. And so in your quiver mutation operation tells you you're going to get a new arrow in that direction, but we already had an arrow going back. So we're going to remove this 2 cycle and not going to have any arrows between these two vertices. And then we're going to change the arrows incident to the vertex you mutate. And so that's what you see here. So in this case, it's not so hard to see it's a mutation. Now, the other 2 local moves where you remove a vertex of degree 1 or you contract an arrow, it's not so hard to see that this yields no change in the quiver. So the first one, the square move is a mutation, and the others, they preserve the quiver. And all right, so that's one piece of data. So next, we're going to talk about these permutations one can associate to a plabic graph. Again, something we've seen in the previous talk. So given a reduced plabic graph, I can associate something called a trip permutation, pi sub g, to it as follows. So my trip is just a path along the graph, and as I travel, if I encounter a white vertex, I'm going to turn maximally left. And if I encounter a black vertex, I'm going to turn maximally right. And so, for example, I'm going to start at a boundary. So I'm going to start the boundary vertex 1. And you see I encounter white vertex, so I turn maximally left. Then a black vertex, right, left, maximally left. And I end at the vertex 3. So this means 1 is mapped to 3. So in my trip permutation pi of g, I'm going to map 1 to 3. Similar, if I started with vertex 2 and I did the trip permutation there, this would be the associated path. And so it says 2 is mapped to 4, and so on. So in this way, you get a permutation in Sn. And then following theorem, which is really due to Postnikov, is that reduced plabic graphs are move equivalent if and only if they have the same trip permutation. So these local moves, they preserve the trip permutation. So sort of you can talk about the whole class of plabic graphs corresponding to a single permutation. Right? Now we want to label the faces of a plabic graph as follows. So you're gonna label the faces by subsets, subsets I of the set 1 through n, such that the little I is in my set whenever the face is to the left of the trip ending at I. Okay, so let's do a picture because it's a very nice explanation. So you have this trip that you use to calculate the trip permutation, and let's say it ends at the vertex I, and then it's going to separate the faces of your plabic graph to the left or to the right, and then all the faces here on the left are going to contain the label I. And then you do this for all the trips. Yeah, so for example, this was one of our trips from 1 to 3. These are the 2 faces to the left of that trip, and so each of them get a label 3. So you see this orange labeled 3. If you do this for the blue trip, all of these faces to the left are going to get a blue label 4, and so on. And so the sort of the miraculous, the beautiful result is that if you do this, then the face labels will all have the same cardinality, which is not at all obvious, but is true. So that's very nice. Okay, so what is the property of these face labels? And so here we have a nice connection, nice description of them. So you have two sets, I and j, of cardinality k inside of consisting of elements 1 through n. And so we say that these 2 sets are said to be weakly separated if there do not exist elements A and C in the I but not J, B and D in J but not I, such that A, B, C, D is cyclically ordered. So the picture is as follows. So if you have the following picture where you have A and C are in one set, B and D are in the other set, and they are sort of crisscross each other, and this set is not weakly separated. So a weakly separated set looks something like this. I can put everything in I but not J on one side, everything in J but not I in the other side, and sort of separate them. Okay, so that's what a weak separation is. And so the elements which are in both can be somehow scattered throughout. We really don't care about that. And then you have a description, a classification of these phase labels in terms of these weakly separated collections by O. Poznikov and Spire, which says that the phase labels of a reduced plabic graph are pairwise weakly separated. So if you went back to that example, the phase labels we got would all be weakly separated. And conversely, any pairwise weakly separated collection can be realized as phase labels of a reduced plabic graphs. So you have this very, very nice correspondence. All right. So again, going back to our cluster algebra, is we had this theorem by Scott that the coordinate ring of the Grassmannian is a cluster algebra where the Plucker coordinates form a subset of the cluster variables. And again, the idea is we can understand these the seeds consisting of Plucker coordinates in terms of plabic graphs. But for this, we need to restrict on the type of plabic graphs you consider. So the ones which correspond to the Grassmannian are said to be of type Kn, and this means that the trip permutation is a permutation and letters. Okay, that's good. And this is quite a strong condition. So it says that the trip permutation sends I to I plus k. Okay, so that's so there's just a pretty much single trip permutation which works for the Grassmannian Kn. These are the plabic graphs we want to consider. And then, well, the cluster structure on the coordinate ring of the Grassmannian is then as follows. So if you want to look at the seeds consisting of Plucker coordinates, so I have here a quiver and I have here a cluster, which is a collection of cluster variables. Well, how do they come? Well, they come from reduced plabic graphs, G, of type Kn, where again, the quiver of the seed comes from the quiver one can associate to the plabic graph, as we've seen. And then the cluster variables here in the seed, they come from the phase labels of the plabic graph up to equivalence. So what is this equivalence? This equivalence is up to the moves that don't change the phase labels. So this first local move that we had, the square move, it will change the phase label. It corresponds to a mutation. The other two will not. And so it's up to that. And by the previous connection to weakly separated collections, we also have that that these seeds corresponds to maximal pairwise weakly separated collections in n choose k. So here the maximally corresponds to the case of the Grassmannian. That the maximally here means that you're only allowed to consider graphs of this special type Kn. Okay, so we have these very, very nice correspondences of understanding the seed, and this is our example. So this is our running example of the plabic graph. This gives us a seed in the cluster algebra. So what I mean is we have these cluster variables that we associate to the phase. So this phase, for example, is labeled 2, 3, which means the associated cluster variable is the Plucker coordinate on the indices 2 and 3. And we see the quiver in orange here, how they are related. So all of these are element of my cluster related together by the quiver we see, and the ones on the boundary, these are the frozen ones, and on the inside, these are the mutable variables. If you just you can forget about sort of the quiver and just think about the phase labels. And so this gives you a maximal weakly separated collection on of 2 elements for a 5-element set. So on n choose 5 choose 2. Yeah, we are of type 2, 5 here. Okay, and so somehow already from here you can recover the quiver as well. So plabic graphs correspond to seeds in the cluster algebra. We have the quiver, we have the cluster variables corresponding to these weakly separated collections in n choose k. All right, so in the remaining time, I want to go back and talk about somehow the type A story. Again, because it's very nice and also it connects quite well with what we've seen before in the previous talk as well. So, so again, AQ suppose is a cluster algebra and it is said to be of type AN if Q is mutation equivalent to the following quiver. So Q can be this quiver, or it can be obtained from this quiver via a sequence of mutations. So the quiver is just on n vertices, and we just have arrows, a single arrow going to the next vertex in that direction. So a very nice quiver of type AN. And then it is known that the coordinate range of the Grassmannian of two planes in an n-dimensional space is of type AN minus 3. And actually, in this case, and only in the case when K is 2, you have the following nice correspondence, where the set of cluster variables agrees exactly with the set of Fluker coordinates. So normally, remember, we had this subset, but only in the case K equals 2, we have a very good understanding of the cluster structure. And moreover, what is this meaning of weak separation? You have two subsets, I and J, in n choose 2, and they are weakly separated if and only if I consists of two elements A and B, J consists of two elements C and D, such that A, B, C, D are cyclically ordered. So this means I have these, this is my A, B, this is my J, C, D, and they don't intersect. So in other words, if I were to label, think of this as a polygon, I label the vertices on the boundary of my circle 1 through n, and I think of my sets I and J as then diagonals in this polygon, then these I and J are weakly separated if and only if they are non-crossing diagonals in an n-gon. And so this very nice bijection we had from the previous slides, which was talking about the cluster structure on the coordinate range of the Grassmannian. So in the special case where this is 2, not general K, then on this side, we have all the seeds of the cluster algebra, not just because all of them are actually associated to Fluker coordinates, so we don't have to have that special condition here. So if you want to know all the seeds of the cluster algebra, they correspond again to reduced plabic graphs of type 2n. But moreover, this weak separation, we can reinterpret as follows. So this maximal collection of pairwise weakly separated sets corresponds to maximal collection of non-crossing diagonals in an n-gon. And so, i.e., this corresponds to a triangulation of an n-gon. Okay, so in the case K equals 2, our seeds are given by triangulations of a polygon. And here's the example. Again, our running example is actually type A. AN, so this story we've seen before of the plabic graph corresponds to the following seed in the cluster algebra. Now, how does this give you a triangulation? So, these mutable variables, these face labels corresponding to the interior faces 2, 4, and 1, 4, they correspond to the diagonals in my polygon. So here's my pentagon, 5 vertices on the boundaries, and the 2, 4 corresponds to the diagonal with edge labels 2 and 4. 1, 4 gives me this other diagonal. You see they are non-crossing because indeed they are weakly separated, and this gives me a triangulation of my pentagon. And you see these boundary faces, these frozen cluster variables, they correspond to the boundary edges of the polygon. So 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 5, 1, 1, 2. So that's my frozen variables. And on the inside, we have the mutable ones corresponding to the actual diagonals in the polygon. So in type A, we have this very, very nice story. And for more general K, we have a good understanding, very good understanding of the seeds that contain Fluker coordinates, but I would say that we don't have a good understanding at all of the other seeds or even of these other cluster variables, which are not Fluker coordinates, of these higher rank cluster variables. And and recently there's been some work done in that direction, and so I think that's very exciting. And you can try to use other tools to study these other higher cluster variables. And so in particular, one can talk about, one can try to consider something called web diagrams, or one can try to get to these cluster variables using categorification and the associative representation theory. So there's been some recent developments in that direction, but it's still I would say a long way to go before we understand these more complicated cluster variables in seeds. And I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.